Good afternoon, Virgo. There's a particular kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that has weight to it, texture, a quality of fullness that makes itself felt in the absence of sound rather than in spite of it. The kind that exists not because nothing is happening, but because something is happening that hasn't yet found its way into word. That is still assembling itself, still gathering the particular form of courage that speaking requires, still navigating the distance between what's true on the inside and what's safe to make visible on the outside. There may be a silence like that between you and someone right now. And what may be worth your attention quietly, without urgency, but with a particular quality of openness, is the possibility that this silence is approaching its end, that something on the other side of it has been building toward a moment of expression that may be closer now than it has ever been before. Something may be about to speak. Let's begin with what it may have taken to arrive at this threshold. Because silence between two people, especially silence that follows something significant, something unfinished, something that was never quite resolved into the clean closure that both parties perhaps told themselves they were moving toward, is rarely as simple as it appears from the outside. It isn't the absence of feeling. More often, it's the presence of feeling that hasn't yet found a form that feels safe enough to offer. This person may have been living inside that particular difficulty, carrying something that the silence was never quite large enough to contain, something that has been pressing against the edges of the quiet between you, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a persistence that may have become, over time, increasingly difficult to manage, increasingly impossible to file away under the heading of something resolved, something finished, something that belonged entirely to a chapter that was now behind them. Because it may not have felt finished. It may have felt in the specific and honest language of their own interior, in the unguarded moments when the story they'd been telling themselves about why the silence made sense became temporarily less convincing, like something interrupted, like a sentence that was never completed, like a possibility that was set aside before it had been genuinely explored for reasons that made sense at the time, but that have perhaps in the intervening quiet begun to look different than they did when the distance first began. There's something about time that changes the way things look. Not always in the direction of clarity. Time can obscure as easily as it can illuminate, but sometimes when the noise of a situation finally settles, what's left behind in the quiet is something essential. Something that was always there, but that required the distance and the stillness to become visible in the way it actually is, rather than the way it was being filtered through the urgency and confusion of the moment. Something may have become visible to this person in the silence about what existed between you, about what they may have underestimated or misread or stepped away from before they fully understood what they were stepping away from, about the specific unrepeatable quality of what you brought to their life, not in the abstract sense of what any caring person might offer, but in the particular sense of what you specifically offered, what you made possible in them that other connections haven't quite managed to replicate. That recognition, when it arrives, tends to arrive with a kind of weight, not the comfortable kind of weight, the kind that demands something, That makes continued silence feel less like a neutral choice and more like an active decision to withhold something that belongs, in some sense, on the other side of the quiet. That produces a restlessness, a low, persistent, increasingly difficult to dismiss restlessness around the question of whether the silence was ever actually the right answer or simply the easier one. What may have shifted recently to bring this to the surface now? Something often catalyzes these moments, a change in circumstance, something in their life that rearranged the landscape enough to make what had been backgrounded suddenly visible in the foreground again. A reminder, unexpected, arriving from an oblique angle, not sought and therefore more difficult to defend against, of something specific about you, about the texture of what you shared, about a quality of connection that turns out to be less replaceable than the silence may have made it possible to pretend. Or perhaps simply the accumulation of enough ordinary time. Enough mornings that started without the specific quality of ease that your presence once provided. Enough conversations that were perfectly fine, warm enough, interesting enough, adequate in every measurable way, but that lacked something that didn't have a name until its absence became undeniable. Enough moments of almost reaching for something that would have been natural once, only to remember that the reaching no longer had a clear destination. Absence teaches things that presence never had to. And it's possible that what this person has been learning in the silence, slowly, reluctantly, with whatever resistance their own pride or protection required before the lesson could land, is something about what they actually had, what they may not have fully recognized while it was present, what may have become more legible in the absence than it ever was in the closeness. There's a question embedded in this title that deserves its own space. Will you give them a chance? Not as a pressure, not as a directive toward any particular answer, but as a genuine inquiry, one that may be worth sitting with honestly, beneath whatever the immediate surface level response might be. Because the immediate response and the honest one don't always arrive at the same time. And the honest one, when it finally surfaces, tends to contain information that the immediate one was protecting you from having to feel too quickly. What do you actually feel when you think about this person? When the silence between you surfaces in your own interior, not as something abstract, but as a specific textured thing, with this specific person's particular weight attached to it, what is there? Is there relief that the silence has persisted? Is there a tenderness that the distance hasn't managed to dissolve? Is there something unfinished that lives in you the way unfinished things do not painfully present in every moment, but never quite fully absent either? Is there a part of you that has been waiting? Not necessarily consciously, not necessarily with hope that was actively tended, but in the quieter sense, in the way certain possibilities remain open inside us without our permission, without our management, simply because they haven't fully resolved into either fulfillment or genuine closure. The way some doors stay slightly ajar no matter how many times we tell ourselves we've shut them. That slight openness, if it exists in you, is information, not a directive, not a conclusion about what you should do or who you should be or what kind of future deserves your investment, just information. An honest read on your own interior that exists beneath the story you may have constructed about where you are and what you've moved past and how thoroughly the chapter that included this person has been brought to completion. Let's talk about new beginnings, what they actually require and what they actually mean. Because the phrase carries a particular kind of weight in the context of something that already existed. A new beginning between two people who have a history isn't the same as a beginning between two people who don't. It doesn't start from zero. It starts from somewhere, from the accumulated texture of what came before, from the specific knowledge each person carries about the other, from the mistakes and the moments of genuine connection, and the things that were left unsaid, and the things that were said badly, and the things that were real, regardless of how they ended. All of that doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the foundation. And a foundation built from real experience, however imperfect, however complicated, has a solidity that a foundation built from nothing doesn't yet possess. There is something in the fact of having weathered something together, even if the weathering produced distance. That creates a particular kind of knowing between two people, a knowing that can, under the right conditions, become the basis for something more honest and more durable than what existed before the difficulty. New beginnings between people with history aren't easier than first beginnings. They tend to be more complicated, more layered, more requiring of honesty, more demanding of the willingness to see clearly rather than through the softening lens of hope or the distorting lens of self-protection. But they're also, in some ways, more potentially real because both people arrive already knowing something, already carrying the evidence of who the other person actually is beneath the best behavior presentation that new connections tend to produce. That knowledge is valuable. And whatever this person may be moving toward, whatever form the breaking of the silence takes, whatever they're gathering themselves to say, it may be arriving not from a place of ignorance about you, but from a place of specific and genuine knowledge, knowledge that has been tested by time and distance and whatever the silence has produced in them, knowledge that, having survived all of that, may carry a quality of honesty that earlier expressions of feeling didn't yet have access to. There are things that tend to be true about people who reach back across a silence, who move towards something they stepped away from, not impulsively, not without having considered the alternative of simply continuing in the direction they were already going. People who do this have usually done something first, usually sat with the question of whether this is right, really right, not just comfortable or convenient or driven by loneliness long enough that the answer they arrived at has a quality of credibility to it. Because reaching back is a particular kind of vulnerable. It requires an admission, implicit if not explicit, that the silence was not the complete answer they may have presented it as, that something wasn't as finished as the distance suggested, that there is something unresolved that matters enough to risk the exposure of acknowledging it. And that risk, the risk of being met with a closure more definitive than the silence, the risk of having the reaching back become the thing that finally ends rather than reopens, is real. It asks something. The fact that they may be willing to ask it says something. Not everything. Not a guarantee of any particular outcome or a promise of any specific future, but something about where they are, about what they've arrived at in their own interior that may be worth considering when it arrives. When the phone lights up or the message comes or the voice reaches across the distance in whatever form it finds to cross it, Here is what the energy of this reading seems most insistent about. This moment, the breaking of this particular silence, the reaching across this particular distance, may carry more weight than its surface presentation suggests, may arrive looking smaller than it is, may come in ordinary language, through ordinary channels, without the ceremony that the internal significance of it perhaps deserves. Don't let the ordinary form cause you to miss the extraordinary content. Because what may be being offered beneath whatever words carry it, beneath whatever imperfect and slightly awkward and deeply human form it arrives in, is something that someone has carried through a silence long enough to know it was real, long enough to know that the silence wasn't resolution, long enough to decide that whatever the risk of breaking it, the risk of maintaining it, had become greater. That's not nothing. That's actually something quite specific and quite significant. A person who has been honest enough with themselves about what they feel to do something about it, who has moved through their own resistance and their own pride and their own very legitimate reasons for staying quiet, and arrived on the other side of all of that at the decision to reach toward you anyway. And the question of whether you give them a chance, that question belongs entirely to you, to your honest assessment of what exists in you when you let yourself look at it clearly, to your own sense of what this person is beneath whatever the difficulty of the silence may have made them seem, to your own knowledge, quiet, specific, accumulated over the actual history of what you've shared, of whether there is something here worth the particular courage that a new beginning with all its complications and requirements would ask of both of you. Only you can answer that. But the answer may be worth knowing honestly, fully, without the protective ambiguity that silence on both sides has perhaps made possible until now. As this reading moves toward its close, here is what feels most important to leave with you. The silence between you may have felt from the inside like an ending, like something that had resolved itself into a final shape that simply needed to be accepted and moved past. And perhaps that's what it was. Perhaps the silence was exactly what it appeared to be, and what's approaching is simply a moment that will confirm that closure in a new way. But there may be another possibility worth holding alongside that one. The possibility that the silence was never an ending, only a pause, a long, complicated, mutually maintained pause in something that didn't actually complete itself. That what broke wasn't the connection, but the momentum. That what exists on the other side of the quiet in both of you, in whatever form it's taken in the specific interior of each person who lived through this particular silence, is something that hasn't finished being what it is yet, something that may still have somewhere to go. And when the phone lights up, when the message arrives, when the voice crosses the distance, when the silence finally breaks in whatever way it chooses to break, you may know in the first unguarded moment, before any of your careful processing begins, exactly how you feel about that. Trust that moment, whatever it contains, whatever it reveals about what you've been carrying in your own quiet, whatever it tells you about the honest answer to the question that may be coming your way. Trust what rises before you have a chance to manage it, because that unedited, unmanaged, arriving before the architecture of your protection has a chance to intervene may be the truest thing you know about this. The silence may be ending. Something is finding its words, and somewhere in you, beneath all the careful quiet you've been keeping, something may already know how it feels about that. Let it